have an improved system. Hopefully you can all hear. What do you think? We should thank Steve for this. Thank you, Steve. All right. So, thanks very much for coming. Hopefully you'll find it useful and you'll be glad you came and all of those good things. I'm just going to introduce the panel. I'm the moderator. My name is Judy Dixon. I'm the chair of the council. That's how I got that job. And introducing the panel members for this evening, we have Steve Schneider, who's our Eastman general manager. I gotta go and, oh, I have a different name on my sheet, so. Okay, we have Bruce Altobelli, who is former council secretary, former Woodlands and Wildlife chair, and on the survey committee, and is going to be designing the survey that goes out to our community in a couple of months. I tried to represent all of the interests available here in Eastman so that we could get a perspective from hopefully everybody. Next we have Susan Meyer, who's representing the ECC tonight. We have Gene Currotto, who's on finance and budget. We have Paul Nicolai, running back. He's been on a couple of task forces and he's the former vice chair of the council. Who do we have next? Nancy Calderwood, who is a special place chair. We have Terry Large, who is from the Village District of Eastman, read water and sewer folks. And then we have Terry Munson, who is sort of representing the interests of condominium owners and their special interests involved in our community. Missing tonight is Doug Kerr, who had volunteered to be here and is not going to be here because he had another commitment. This being the fact that he is a new grandparent again. His latest grandson was born at 12:15 a.m. this morning, and he's babysitting the other grandchildren at 11 a.m. And so consider that a more pressing responsibility than coming here to talk about accessory dwelling units. Our general procedure tonight is I have a prepared list of questions which I will be asking. They're not specific questions for specific individuals on the panel. I will ask the question, and anybody on the panel who has something to say will say by raising their hands. I'll hand the single microphone to that person, and we'll just move it around until everybody's done. And then we'll go on to the next prepared question. After we're done with all of the prepared questions, which are either questions that I put together or that people submitted. Community members were invited to submit questions if they wanted to, and so there are a number of questions that were specifically presented by individual community members. We're gonna go through that whole list. Hopefully, when we get to the end of that list, it will have answered most of the questions you have. Nevertheless, when we're done with the prepared list of questions, then you have an opportunity to either stand up and state a position, this is what I want, this is why I think we should do this, or you have an opportunity to ask questions. When you ask a question, it will be to the panel at large. In other words, you won't be specifically saying, Steve, what about this? Okay, but if you do have a question, certainly anybody on the panel can respond to it and hopefully give you an answer that will be satisfactory. Following that, there will be a recording of tonight's meeting that will be available to anybody in the community. So you can attend again if you want to.
Wait over there.
Yes. Or after that, basically in the next 2 weeks, I will be preparing a summary of all of the remarks made at the meeting by everybody. And then this will go out to the whole community. So those who were not able to attend tonight will have an idea of what was said and the comments that were made. So this is the procedure, and the idea will be you will have that information before you get the community survey. So you'll be better prepared to say, yeah, this is what I want, or no, this is what I don't want. All right, so thank you very much again for coming. Hopefully you'll feel grateful at the end of the night. If not, I do want to mention that we do end at 8 o'clock. Okay. All right. Okay, so as a preliminary, we're here to discuss accessory dwelling units. So what is an accessory dwelling unit? Well, accessory dwelling units, ADUs, are a secondary residential unit located on the same lot as a primary residence. ADUs are smaller in size than the primary home. They are independent living spaces that typically include a kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and separate entrance. These units are also known by other names like granny flats, in-law suites, backyard cottages, or garage apartments. Eastman has not permitted ADUs in the past. The purpose of the survey ultimately will be determine what the community wants, what they want to permit, and what they don't want to permit in the future. In terms of our current declaration of covenants and restrictions, the specific definition that we have adopted for purposes of ADUs are a residential living unit that is either within or attached to a single-family dwelling that offers independent living facilities for one or more individuals, including sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation, all on the same parcel of land as the principal dwelling unit it accompanies. Okay, so that's what we're talking about this evening. First question. What is allowed now for in-laws, parents, children, relatives, guests, renters, living accommodations? What can you have now that are allowed under the rules of the DCR? Anyone want to address that?
Hot potato here? Okay. So what is allowed? With respect to in-laws or parents, children, or relatives, or guests, or renters, you're allowed to have those folks reside with you as long as there isn't a separate, and by separate we mean there's a physical barrier or it's completely separated from the main unit space. So those spaces, what we think of as Judy just described as an ADU, an in-law suite doesn't necessarily meet the standard of an ADU because it may or may not be physically separate from the main dwelling unit. It gets squishy in terms of, well, does a door count? Sort of. It's got to be locked on both sides. You can't kind of get from one side to the other. Eastman's practice has been to not allow folks to rent and occupy at the same time, right? So you may have these extra spaces above your garage or in your basement, and as long as you're not renting it and occupying it, Eastman, for the past 50 plus years, hasn't had an issue with that. This is also something that isn't necessarily widespread throughout the community. In the 50 plus years that Eastman's been in existence, there may be 30 to 40 to 50 of these things that kind of are in existence that haven't necessarily crossed the threshold of owner occupied and renting at the same time. When we've been made aware of folks living and renting in the same premise, ECC's done a good job, and Eastman in general has done a good job of prohibiting that and stopping that activity. But for the most part, if you've got a second kitchen in your basement, you've got a space above your garage, and you're not renting it out, I would say Eastman is going to tolerate that. It's when you cross over that threshold of renting it and living there at the same time that we begin to take action. Am I saying anything out of line? Yeah.
Okay, does anybody else have anything to say on the issue?
Paul?
Well, so, if there is an ADU, if there is an ADU, it's not sanctioned, let's put it that way. And nobody does anything about it, because if you have a two-bedroom thing, and your in-laws come and visit for a week or 2 weeks, or your kids come and visit, nobody cares. But, it's your family, who cares? But the rules don't allow for an ADU. How they happen is because ECC never investigates the interior of the property. They only look at the exterior. So if somebody builds extra rooms in or whatever, it just happens. And as Steve said, it's when you start renting part of the property and living part of the property. We had 2 years ago, somebody bought 3 houses and split them up and started renting out both ends of them. We stopped that. So that's basically where the threshold is.
And I would agree, when ECC becomes aware of such a situation, we involve Steve and take care of the issue.
Okay, so the next question is, on the stuff that's allowed right now, how do we presently pay for it? How do we take care of the amenities? How do we take care of paying for staff? How do we take care of water and sewer? And what's included in the yearly fee? And what requires separate guest fees?
So, at some point, the mic will, yeah. So, I would say 99% of your assessments go towards paying for all of those things, right? So it goes towards paying for the upkeep of the amenities, the staff, the facilities that we have, your village district quarterly fees.
I'll care for it when you're finished with
Okay,
the
yeah.
ECA stuff.
That's covered by your EC or your VDE commitment. There are guest passes that are available. One of the traditions of Eastman is that a lot of folks discovered this place by renting for a week or two, right? And so that's been a strong tradition, and it's not one that at least we have any interest right now in changing. And so you are able to purchase a guest pass where you can go and use the facilities at South Cove. You can go come here and use the driving range and the putting green. You can go to the beaches. So there is an opportunity for renters to purchase a guest pass. Those folks that rent their property long-term are able to transfer their privileges to the long-term renters, and that's something that's been in existence for a while, and so that's another opportunity for renters to occupy or use the amenities, but they can't do so and the owner at the same time. Somebody would have to pay an additional amenity fee for that to occur. So for the most part, it is our assessments that pay for these things, and that's been our practice.
Thanks, Steve. From the VDE perspective, both sewer and water services have two components of rates. One is a fixed portion, both sewer and water each have a fixed portion, and a usage portion, which is based upon the volume of water that you consume or bring into your home, which miraculously is equal to the presumption of the amount of water that goes out of your home if you're a sewer customer. So we have the practice of where a second connection is desired for a property. We just recently had a request for a second water connection on a property for a studio that was being constructed in I believe in a garage space, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. So that is in fact a second metered location, which has a second volume portion of their fee as well. So that's our current historic practice that we would presume would go forward in an ADU situation.
So, as Steve mentioned, there's really two ways that people can use amenities beyond the owners. One is guest passes, and every property gets 14 guest passes a year that you can use for friends, relatives, whoever comes up and visits. And then renters can, or whatever, can buy passes. So over the last 7 months, okay, 183 guest passes have been used. Okay, which frankly, 183 for 7 months over the summer. And then 46 guest passes have been bought. So it just tells you that these things are more honored in the breach than in the fact, which is part of this enforcement question as you allow ADUs to be built.
I just want to comment, Terry, relative to that second connection. I believe that is in all likelihood a pottery studio that went in. It was not an ADU.
Right.
To the best of my knowledge, there are vanishingly small numbers of multiple hookups. Is that correct?
I believe that to be true.
Okay.
I'll add a comment that I believe guest passes are only needed for South Cove, the pool and the fitness facility.
Pickleball.
Yeah, and pickleball.
Maybe tennis.
Much more of an honor system there because we don't have the personnel down here monitoring who's playing.
Thanks, and even though I'm just the moderator, let's just remind the fact that we pay for the amenities on a per lot basis, essentially. So you have one owner, one official owner, and you pay one fee. And that includes you, your spouse, your kids, your parents, and it's all for one fee. So that's the current system we have right now. All right, the next question is, how are ADUs different? And I think we've sort of answered that. Yes? Okay, next question. Is it agreed that ADUs will mean more people in Eastman?
Build a room that people will live in, that's independent? I think the answer is pretty obvious, yes. There'll be more people. There are ADUs are essentially a two-family house. Call it a duplex in other areas, which is usually a bigger unit, but still it's a two-family house.
That's the whole point of ADUs, right? To increase the stock of housing. So if you increase the stock of housing, unless you're gonna put cows in it, I guess you'll have more people.
Okay, so again, another question that might be obvious. Is it agreed that more people means higher costs for amenities, for staff, for maintenance, for insurance? Water and sewer is kind of obvious, but it may mean more expenses for water and sewer because we may need to do more repairs sooner based on more use. Okay. Comments, anybody?
Steve, am I correct in assuming that much of the cost that we incur is driven by the physical infrastructure that we support and also by the staffing required to support that physical infrastructure? Okay, in that case, it's not clear to me that a small number of additional people is going to make a significant difference in the cost to support that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It'd be silly, but
Any other comments?
I'll let you talk first. Oh my God.
Sure about that?
This is a conversation I've had with my wife, Carol. Most of you may know her because she is the one that everybody knows. She's very much a proponent of aging in place, making sure that you can, if you want to have a family member nearby and want to let them live there, can we make that happen? So she has a bias. I am open-minded to it, to be honest with you. And when I think about it, and I say, well, we've gotten 50-some years here, and we've got 30, 40, 50 of these things among us, and that's about 3% of our 1,400 lots. If it doubles, it'll be 6%. You know, I jokingly asked Terry earlier, I said, how much water does an ADU use? And he said, it varies. And he's right. Now, the question really is, how much do you really think it's going to cost us in maintenance and staffing and everything else? And when I worked in what I used to work in, you know, your activities filled your day. You wanted to do more things and you needed more people to do more things, but you didn't need it immediately. You might have needed it a little bit. I haven't a clue right now how much more it would cost us if 30 more ADUs came on board. Yes, it would have more people there. I haven't a clue what it would cost.
So I'm writing the rules now for the town of Grantham, because I'm on the zoning board. And the Grantham rule, assuming they pass what I write, the Grantham rule will say that an ADU can be a maximum of 950 square feet, can have 2 bedrooms with 2 occupants for each bedroom. So that each ADU would add 4 people to whatever, potential, right? So, and if 10% of the properties built ADUs, because now they're legal, that's 100 ADUs, potentially 400 people. And so that'll be what that'll be. Remember, guys, how we pay for things around in Eastman is by dwelling unit, not by property. Every dwelling unit, every condo, every house pays $4,000. So if a house has an ADU now, that's 2 dwelling units. And the numbers say that if you have an ADU and you rent the ADU, in this area, your rental income will be somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000 a year. That's what you could expect for income. So, you know, this is just me. My view is the simple way to do this, if you're going to do it, say, okay, you can build ADUs, you can rent the ADUs. If you have an ADU, you pay another $4,000 a year because it's another dwelling unit, just like the other dwelling unit. And so that's it. Then all the costs will be covered. The road maintenance, all the rest of it will be covered because we're charging the ADU the same thing we charge a condo. It is a condo, except the ownership.
I'll just add that I think the long-term impact is really what we need to think about here. Today, it's not a problem. Even tomorrow, it might not be a problem. But it is a slippery slope that you go down. And with the proliferation, we're in a very desirable area here now. As you can see that from the assessed value of your homes over the last 5 years. There's a major housing crisis throughout the country, particularly here in the Upper Valley. But it's not on Eastman's responsibility to take care of that housing. And I should note the fact that I've been involved with affordable housing in the Upper Valley for 25 years, still am. I'm very much a proponent of ADUs, but I don't think they belong in Eastman. I think it's a slippery slope that we go down. In 10, 15, 20 years from now, and there's many people here who've been here 30, 40 years and have seen a lot of changes and a lot of very positive changes, I think. And we don't know what's going to happen 40 years from now. These ADUs are forever, right? You put it in your house, you build a new bathroom, a new kitchen, you're not going to tear those out. And it will attract, I believe it will attract, because even though we're not technically a resort area, I think it's going to attract Airbnb type rentals, we already have that going on here now. So, probably say more on that later, but that's where I fall on this thing right now. I love ADUs, but I don't think they're appropriate here in Eastman.
Okay, if there are higher costs, how do you believe those higher costs should be paid?
Paul always said it.
Yeah, in my opinion, is the only other way you can do it is to move to a municipal assessment system, which will cost us $6 figures to implement, i.e., we would take the property value of each property. You take the property value of each property and you would send it to, it's like a tax bill, except it's an HOA bill. But that would require a total revamp of our accounting system, staffing up our accounting crew, because every year those assessment numbers change. What we have now is simple. Take the amount of money we've got to raise, divide it by the 1,400, send a bill. And so, unless you want to change things over to a value-based system, you just got to charge for the dwelling unit, like we do for condos now.
So the presumed increase in cost associated with more water consumption or more wastewater produced would be covered by the variable cost or the variable rate that we currently charge by the VDE. So we already have a mechanism in place that would mirror collection of revenue to match the anticipated cost. I need to speak to Paul's point a second ago. You know, a portion of the VDE's revenue comes from taxation. So there is already a mechanism in place where VDE through the town of Grantham is collecting revenue that is provided to the VDE. So I'm not sure how that would be developed in an ECA to the town of Grantham situation, but since the VDE is a municipality, our relationship with the town is different than the ECA's.
Thanks. Next question. Should ADUs be allowed, but only for restricted purposes? For example, aging in place. And as a subcategory, then how does one define family member?
So, two comments here. We can define, we've certainly defined EDUs right now in the DCR, and I think we based it on state definition. But we can define it however we want, right? We're a private entity, we're a piece of, one giant big piece of private property, and we can define what an EDU is however we want. So, if we want to say it can only be for folks 55 and over, we'll figure out a way that we can administer that, and that becomes reality. If we want to allow it for caregivers or family members, we can make those adjustments as well. So we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we define EDUs. The second comment is regarding definitions of family members. And we've stayed clear of that on purpose because it's such a fluid definition, right? What is a family? Do you have to be blood related? I don't know. Do you just have to live together? Is that a family? People define family in a lot of different ways. And so you won't see a definition of family in the DCR. And I'm not sure that we're ever going to try to define that because it's going to open up more grief for us than it's worth.
Thanks, Steve. So bring up the point of aging in place. So I'm thinking in terms of the condos, and I was envisioning ADU as being somebody lives upstairs, has their own bedroom, has their own bathroom, but shares the kitchen. It sounds to me like that's not an ADU. But if you're talking about somebody, like say you're aging in place, you know, your finances have changed, you can't afford to stay in your condo, so you get somebody to come in to help share that costs, but also there's another individual in the house with you, you know, to just to help you out. So, but you're saying that you cannot do that now? Or what if you call her your sister, you know? But the idea is this person would pay you rent. That's the difference, right? They would pay you rent.
Yeah, lucky me. So, number one, I just worked for a year with Judy and others to rewrite the DCR, right? And let me tell you, there was a discussion, let's define family, ixnay to that. Okay, we're not doing it. Zoning law for the last 50 years has been moving away from defining family, because that's the way the world is. In terms of a caregiver, okay, there is this New Hampshire law, which the rental task force said that we should recognize it, but the board decided not to. There's a New Hampshire law that says that you can have a caregiver live with you, pay you rent, okay, that's partly offset by what you pay them, whatever, but it's a one-page document that you do, and that person can live, regardless of zoning law, that person becomes a member of your family under New Hampshire law, as long as that agreement's in force, or in place. So we had said, Eastman should recognize that. By the way, Medicaid says that if you want reimbursement for a live-in healthcare, they gotta live in the unit, not in another unit. So an ADU they wouldn't qualify because they're in a separate unit. In terms of in-laws, I know I'm old and whatnot, but in-laws in my life used to be an in-law apartment, i.e. mom and dad have a bedroom with a bathroom, maybe a sitting room in the same house. And they'd have dinner with us and have lunch with us, take the kids out, do babysitting. So it's just, that's a lifestyle question of whether you do it by ADU or do it by in-law apartment. But we're never gonna define family, I know that.
Okay, so, next question. How would any restrictions, that is, if you approve an ADU for restricted purposes, for example, aging in place, how would those restrictions be monitored or enforced? By staff, by neighbor reporting, by the honor system only?
Yeah, so in all likelihood, it's gonna fall to administration, right? It should be a staff responsibility. And there are plenty of 55+ communities in existence in the world, and so there are best practices and guidance out there already. So if Eastman says we wanna come up with a way that we can monitor restrictions, it wouldn't take, we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel there. There are plenty of examples out there where we could pick and choose what makes sense for us and then adapt it for our own use. You know, the way that the community functions in terms of folks have concerns or I'm gonna call it complaint, but an observation about what's happening at a neighbor or within their neighborhood. You know, that I think that's part of what we do. You know, I have a concern that there's a property that the grass is too high, or there are 3 unregistered vehicles on the property, or you know, the color isn't what it should be. So those things happen, right? So we don't go out there and look for it, but when the neighbors share or community members share, we certainly go out and investigate. And I think that would be part of how we would monitor restrictions going forward, but it wouldn't be the main source. It's not the main source now.
I was just gonna say, ECC gets complaints, I wouldn't say it was all that frequently, but it happens. And when ECC gets complaints, it gets put on the visit list and we go out and figure out, is this a complaint that's a reasonable complaint or is it not a reasonable complaint, right? Sometimes they're not reasonable complaints and sometimes they are. But in the case of the people who were renting their facilities, a complaint came in and we involved Steve, you know? And that's the partnership that exists between ECC and administration.
So that, I really hate the idea of a neighbor turning in a neighbor. But it seems to me if you did decide to do the EDUs, that there's ways that you, if somebody wanted to put in a kitchen, they've gotta get a building permit, they have to go through their HOA. And Terry was just talking about, somebody wanted a different metered thing, and so that way, that's one way to check on things, which is a lot better than a neighbor turning a neighbor in. I don't know, that makes me cringe.
I just hope also that we are clear about, when we move ahead with rentals. Because I know they do exist, and, being in a group of condos, we can't add rooms, so we're not gonna have ADUs on there. But we may, be alone and have, 3 bedrooms, 3 baths, and rent the lower level. And it's just not clear, and I think it needs to be clarified for everyone, so a neighbor doesn't say, oh, Andrew over here is renting his place and living in it. I'm not sure that's illegal right now, but I'd like to have it clarified for a lot of condo owners.
So, that's up to Steve. I will tell you that state law and Grantham will not require a separate water and sewer hookup for an ADU. We're not legally able to do that. So if somebody builds an ADU in Eastman and doesn't want a separate water and sewer hookup, they can do it, because state law and Grantham will not enforce a separate hookup.
Next question. Should ADUs be rented? How should rentals be monitored and the rules enforced?
I'll bite on this one. The rental policy, board policy 11, refers to an allowance for owners to permitted to rent their property. Implicit in that is the whole property, not a piece of the property, the whole property. And that's consistent with the DCR, which defines a single-family dwelling as a dwelling unit for a single family. Not for multiple families, but for a single family. So all of that is tied up in being consistent between board policy and the DCR with regarding a dwelling unit as a single family unit, however you define family.
So ultimately, whether or not ADUs can be rented, as Susan described, it's community driven, right? It's not gonna be my decision. That's not what you paid me to do. This is your community, and so you decide how you wanna structure this thing. And it's my job to make sure that it gets administered fairly and properly. So whether or not whether or not ADUs are allowed to be rented, the purpose, I think, of this evening is to educate, so that when you are presented with the community survey early next year, you have a strong base of knowledge to say, yeah, you know what, I understand the issues, and I do think, yes, they should be rented, or no, I understand the issues, and that's not something that I want Eastman to become. So it's very much a community decision, and not one that administration gets to, or should be making.
Her question really was to reiterate what you said earlier about.
Can somebody live and rent at the same time? No. Yeah, that currently that's not allowed.
And that's clear.
That's clear, yeah.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on whether or not ADUs should be rented out? Okay. Next, if there is an increase in rental units by allowing ADUs to be rented out, will that affect the nature of the Eastman community and volunteer support activities?
I'll take a first shot and I'll hand it off the ball. Being a former landlord, my experience is that renters don't care as much about the property or the community as owners do. Actually, our whole country was founded on that principle. Only property owners could vote, if you recall. I think it's really quite that simple. Now, there's always exceptions to the rule. There are many renters out there who are absolutely wonderful people, take better care of the house than I would, which would be saying something. But the majority, though, you can't, they got no investment, they got no skin in the game, as we say. So I think it would change the character, which is why I'm opposed to ADUs, separate living units, being allowed here at Eastman.
So, yeah, because you always have the renter-owner thing that's been going on forever. However, I have to tell you that personally, I think there's a separate, different effect at Eastman. And you all know that if it weren't for the tens of thousands of volunteer hours a year, your fees would be $8,000 a year, okay? You know, Dave's out there making sure the forests are good. I'm doing finance stuff. He's doing finance. We're all doing something, right? I'll bet you the value of those hours is $500,000 to $1 million a year. If you increase the number of long-term renters with ADUs and whatnot, you should not expect those people to say, we're gonna volunteer, we're gonna go out there and trim the trails, we're gonna fix the pickleball. They're not going to do it, okay? Not because they're bad people. It's because they come here to live here, to go to work, to feed their kids, it just got busy lives, and that life does not include, generally speaking, volunteering hours to do the kinds of things that we run this place on. If we didn't have the volunteer hours that we do here, we would be, well, I don't know, we wouldn't be Eastman. We'd be any regular old subdivision, because that's how regular subdivisions work, right? I mean, they build houses, they sell houses, people live in them. That would be Eastman. Right now, it's the hours of work, it's the cooperation, it's all the involvement that creates the community. And I'm not saying it's bad to rent to people, I'm not saying it's evil. I'm saying if you build 100 ADUs and 400 people live in them, there won't be more than 4 or 5 volunteers out of the 400 because they don't have the same orientation. So it will change the neighborhood.
Earlier on, we had a question that says, is it agreed that ADUs will mean more people in Eastman? The debate that I'm hearing just now is it agreed that ADUs mean that there will be fewer owners in Eastman? And I think that that's not clear. We're talking about an additional operating unit, an additional living unit on a property that some people will rent, which does not necessarily displace owners. So I guess I have to edge a bit the discussion that we just heard, because I don't believe that it means that we will have fewer owners, my opinion.
I agree with you, Tony, excuse me, Terry, whoever you are. And actually, the Grantham zoning ordinance requires the owner to live in either the primary residence or the accessory ADU. So they've got to be on site. It's not like a random landlord living in New York City who buys up Eastman and makes properties and makes a lot of money. That's not what this is. I appreciate the understanding of ownership versus renters. For a kid who didn't own his first house or have a family own their first house until I was in my 20s. You know, my parents didn't volunteer very much, I gotta admit that. And I didn't either when I was a kid and a young guy. And it comes with age, and it comes with understanding, and it comes with community. Now, one of the nice things about this community is it is inviting, and it is attractive, and you will have people, I think, maybe I'm wrong, that would want to be part of that community, volunteer or not, okay?
So I just wanted to add the point, if the people who are renting an AUD are retired, then I think they will volunteer. And it's more an age thing. Young people who are working, who have children, they don't have the time to do it. And frankly, it's our time as retired people. So I think it's possible we can get people, if they're to be retired. And it seems like a good idea for retirement too, for AU, maybe you can't afford something like this on your own.
Okay, next question. Should ADUs be limited to larger properties, for example, 1 acre or more?
I'm generally opposed to that, creating a new class of property owners.
Personally, the thought of having mini pods springing up in Eastman is to me not an attractive thought. And I don't care what size the lot is.
I think there's a natural limitation to the size of a lot that could accommodate a separate structure from ADU. So I'm living on a half-acre lot on Greenswood Drive that would not be able to accommodate an ADU. Our condominium owners here don't have access to be able to allow an ADU associated with their property. So there is already a natural limitation. What's could be construed to be addressed by this question is, do we define it? But in terms of thinking about what the magnitude of the potential population of ADUs is in the community, I think there's a natural limitation already in place.
So, if you wanted to do something like controlling pods, etc., you'd have to do it in the DCR or the bylaws, because the town of Grantham and state law is such that Grantham will not be able to tell you that you cannot have either an attached or detached ADU as long as it meets the overall setback and sideback requirements of the property. And if there is a non-conforming property now that you want to convert to an ADU, the town will be required to allow it. So if you're gonna have restrictions, say it's gotta be a 1 acre lot or it's gotta be whatever, you're gonna have to do that in the DCR, because the state law in town will not cognize that.
So if you don't want pods springing up, let that be a community message.
Okay, so in terms of my pre-printed questions, I think we've answered a number of them, but one of the questions was, are we considering tiny homes?
Actually, the notion that some property owner might want to put up a tiny home on their lot as the single structure on that lot is not antithetical to the rules. Period.
There's one on Brookridge Drive, put up in the last 18 months, I think.
Is it the only house on the property?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alrighty, so moving on, how would the different rules of the 3 different towns affect Eastman's rules?
Yeah, so, Eastman, as I said before, we are one giant piece of private property, and so we can establish our own rules. The state ADU laws have been on the books since 2017. There was a recent revision that was passed this year. But we have an opinion from our attorney that says we can, because we are private, we can regulate how we so choose. And so even though the law of New Hampshire governs the 3 municipalities, Enfield, Springfield, and Grantham, Eastman, because we are a piece of private property, considered, their rules really aren't impactful on us.
Except for permit.
Except,
Permitting? Huh? Permitting. Because the rules could be different by town for permitting.
If you don't talk into the microphone, then they can't hear you. Okay, what would the penalties be for failure to comply with any ADU regulations that ECA might establish?
I'd say the same penalties that would be incurred if any of the other regulations were violated, you know? If you clear cut your lot, ECC's gonna levy some fines, what can I say? That's a violation of a regulation.
Okay, and the final question on the prepared list is, given that the ADU regulations on a state level were passed to counter a housing shortage in New Hampshire, and that Eastman is a community with a high percentage of vacation/weekend homes, the opposite may occur if more investors purchase property solely for rental income. What is the plan to prevent that from happening? Want me to repeat the question?
Well, I can't speak to any plans to prevent that from happening. I was on the rec task force and we asked similar demographic questions as the regular community survey that was done 3 years ago. The simple number here is about 76% of all the owners consider Eastman their primary residence. So roughly a quarter of the people are seasonal, or owners not living here, small percentage of those. The survey, and I don't necessarily, I think it's potentially self-limiting and biasing, also said 97% responded they didn't rent their property out at all. But I tend to believe that's understated, but that's just my opinion.
So, I think the question refers to what's going on around the country. With the satiation of Airbnb and VRBO, you have in some areas, especially vacation resort areas, houses being taken off the housing market and put into the rental market by reason of ownership change. So that's got nothing really to do with ADU because of the way New Hampshire law is set up. where the towns can require that the principal owner, the owner be in one of the two units. So the ADU issue won't drive that. What will drive it is investor ownership. Around the country now, 20% of single-family homes are owned by investors. In New Hampshire, it's 4%. So sooner or later, you gotta expect the 4 to get closer to 20. And when that happens, you will see houses coming off the housing market and into the rental market, because that's why investors buy the houses.
I would observe that the rental task force did its work, and board policy 11 was put in place. Board policy 11 deals with rental policies, and it fairly clearly states that the owner is responsible if the tenant misbehaves.
Okay, that completes the prepared questions, and so, oh, I'm sorry.
So, Madam Moderator, I apologize, but I believe that there was one previously prepared question that we might have skipped over. And the only reason why I know it was skipped over is because I asked it to be asked. So the question is, what viable alternatives are to ADUs to meet the same needs? And we've had a wonderful conversation this evening, but what I've not heard defined yet amongst the panel, and maybe not among, is state law is providing this opportunity, or some might view it as a requirement. But the rationale, the reason, the why Eastmanites would be supportive of allowing ADUs. To me, that's a fundamental question. Why do we want to do this? You know, that you come out on the yes, I support, or no, I don't, but what's the why? And sorry for the long introduction, but the reason I pose that is there was an organization, a subcommittee of the Eastman Cares community, Eastman Cares organization, that spent a fair amount of time and energy looking at 55 plus communities for aging in place possibilities. And to me, you know, I'm taking off my VDE hat and I'm wearing my I live in this community hat. That seemed as though it was a reason why our community would be supportive of ADUs, to provide an opportunity for those that live in our community today, or are relatives of those that live in our community today, to be able to age in place and be in proximity to family. And I'm seeing a fair number of head nodding. I'll phrase it this way. The subcommittee that was looking at the 55 plus community were exhausted by their efforts to go forward, to actually put forward a proposal. And as a result, there is no further action on that. And one of the steps that was considered as important was a review of sizable parcels of land in our community that could potentially be developed as small 55 plus 5, 7, 10 condominium units with primary first floor living that would afford, or more likely afford, aging in place type activities. So, you know, it would be its own set. Well, I had the good fortune to be a part of that team, and it would have been a separate living unit for my mom and dad that wouldn't be on my property, that I would drive the quarter of a mile to their home to visit with them, that they could drive to my home for dinner. They would be in their own unit with other 55 plus residents. The Common Properties Committee, that I also chair, sought funding to be able to do what we call the highest and best use analysis of 5 of the larger parcels of property in our community. And the rationale behind that was, we've got these parcels, what should they be used for? Not to do them, We don't have the power to decide that. Well, let's have some assessment that gives intelligence behind what these could be used for. We've had a lot of common conversation about the stump dump, one of our favorite parcels of land. Could that be a 55+ community? Maybe not. But there are other parcels of land that investing some time, which requires some money, to say, this could be this, and that could be that, rather than, in the common property parlance, the elbowing that will occur someday when somebody wants to build a dog park versus a bike park versus we should do it in a logical, well thought out, planned manner with intelligence as opposed to who shows up first at the table. So I believe that there are viable alternatives. They're going to take some time, energy, and money to put forward. It doesn't preclude that there would be an ADU somewhere else. But if the reason is that we want to afford people the opportunity to age in place in this community with one floor living, there are viable alternatives. It just takes some time, energy, and money to be able to facilitate that. So my apologies.
Oh, no, my apologies. I'm sorry.
But I think that's important for us to consider.
Okay, now having completed the prepared questions.
All right.
All right, we're ready for input from you folks. So if you want to raise your hand. Okay.
Hi, I'm Bill Wicks. Question I have is that the state has said this is what they want, and this is what we should be doing. But we're saying we're a private community. Can't the state just come in and say no? I mean, are we gonna go to court on this?
Is that your last question?
Well, okay, I'd like an answer to the first one.
Okay. So, this goes back to how Eastman can manage its own community. Goes back to a decision that the community made to cease operations at the ski hill, right? And we were sued by a member saying, no, I bought into this place, it was existing, it needs to stay, that's the rule. And this went all the way to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And that ruling, Schaefer versus Eastman, you can look it up, lays the foundation for Eastman as a private community being able to govern and regulate itself. And so our attorney is using, same attorney defended us at the Supreme Court level, is saying that because we are a private community, because we have an existing set of rules and guidelines, our DCR, our board policy, our ACC bylaws, our council, all those things demonstrate that we are a functioning unit that can govern itself. And so because of that, we can tell the state that, yes, you have your rule, but we're a piece of private property and we're gonna do what we want. So consider a piece of private property outside of Eastman, right? So I don't live in the community, I live in Enfield. It's my choice as a private property owner to decide whether or not I wanna have an ADU or not on my property. The state says that I can do it, but it's up to me to determine whether or not I want to do it. Same logic, the same analogy applies to Eastman as a community. We can say yes or no, and right now the answer is no. We don't allow ADUs, even though the state says it is something that is allowed.
One question at a time, please.
Yeah.
So let's move on to somebody else. We'll come back to you.
I'd like to offer an alternative or an addition to the comment that this is about aging in place. I'd say it's often also a problem of demographics that we have right here at Eastman, and we also have around the state. And that is that our population is getting older, and we have fewer and fewer young people moving into our community and into our state. and we need them. We can't get by, they can't, we need people to do the maintenance, to do the other things and not have to drive half an hour, 45 minutes to get here to do that. And one of the things that this does, we've actually heard multiple times, I've heard at DH, and I'm sure many of you have as well, that they have had doctors and residents turn them down because they cannot find housing that they can afford. Right now, the median is $550,000 a house to buy a median priced house here. When we moved into Eastman 10 years ago, we got a deal. I mean, we paid less than $100,000 for our condo. It never been improved, but it was a deal. And we could make those choices inside, what we wanted to do with our improvements. But it's not that way anymore. And we're not an accessible community, either because of age or because of pricing. And I think if we want to be able to continue this community we've all been very proud of our multi-generational awards that we've received. And they're priced out. And if we want truly to have that kind of accessibility and have our kids or our grandkids be able to move here, we have to do something. And an ADU is a way to do that.
Next person.
Thanks, Mark Ellis, West Shore. So I have a question and then kind of a position statement. So my current house, we've got 3 floors, and the lower level has got a bedroom, a bathroom, and kind of a sitting area. We had my 90-year-old mother-in-law living with us for a number of years before she passed away. Luckily, she was mobile enough that she could live on the main floor with us, but we had always talked about if she ever got wheelchair bound, we'd probably have her live in that lower level because it would be very easy to get at with a wheelchair. And if she was not able to get up and down the stairs, we had thought about, well, maybe we would put a microwave oven or something down there so that she could make herself a TV dinner or whatever when it was harder for her to get up and eat with us. My understanding of the current definition of an ADU is the minute I put a microwave or some method of cooking in that lower level, it immediately becomes an ADU. Am I right or am I wrong? So what makes it an ADU?
It needs to be a separate unit. So it either needs to be separate from your main house, so above a garage, or a separate little building.
Separate entrance?
Or a separate entrance, or it needs to have a door that is a barrier that is locked, both sides, right? So what you described isn't an ADU.
Okay, so it did have an entrance in the lower level, but there was no door, there was a stairway that went up and down. Okay, so as long as it's not buried off, you're good to go. Okay, good. So my position statement is, I really would like to have us find a way to be able to support aging in place. You know, whether it was in my case, we had my mother-in-law living with us. She's passed now, but as my wife and I get older, we've always talked about potentially turning the house over to my adult children, and then maybe they live in there and they're taking care of us. And I just want to make sure that however we get this done, that we have the ability to support that type of a concept.
Thanks. I just wanted to make, I think Steve was, very accurate in what he said in the case for the Supreme Court, but I want to make just a small clarification so that people understand the distinctions. The issue is, as you move down to more local governance and as you move into private communities, which are called communities of common interest, and this goes back a long ways to property law before statute, the communities of common interest are able to be more restrictive than what's required in Grantham, and Grantham can be more restrictive than what's required by the state,
and so on, but they can be not less restrictive. So let's say the state had a minimum speed limit. We couldn't suddenly say that in Eastman, because we're a community of private interest, we're gonna have 65-mile-an-hour speed limits on our roads. That would not be consistent with the Supreme Court ruling. So as we craft these, and as we look at DCRs, which are our policy documents, and then as we look at bylaws and technical instructions and implementing documents, they all must logically follow in this legal construct. So it is true that we can set up these rules, but we can't be less restrictive than the obligations that exist in the governance above us.
Jim McCombie, Eastman. Question, I'm looking for clarification on something that was said earlier. My understanding is that state and local ordinances require that the homeowner live in one of the dwellings on a property with an ADU, correct? And that restriction would apply to Eastman. So my question is, someone, or looking for confirmation on this, that if you were a homeowner in Eastman and you rented your home, you could not add an ADU to that property, because then you would have two renters, correct? So if you own a home and you're renting it and you're selling, I guess the buyer would have to understand that. And if you own multiple properties in Eastman, that you could only rent out the property or build an ADU on the property that you live, upon which you live. And you would have to live on, if you own two, say one or the other.
Right.
Correct?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What you could do is occupy and rent. So the two units would be occupied at the same time. You just can't rent both.
But you can sell both.
You have to sell both. The law requires it has to be unified ownership. I can't condo it, I can't separate.
My question, Bob Munson, my question is more about if we do this, how would we manage that? So I guess it's more to you, Steve, is that it seems to me that working off what Ellis was talking about and what other people have talked about, that having the ability to maybe massage your dwelling in a way that allows you or a family member to live with you full time, which might cause some significant impact on the structure. How is Eastman, at East Lake, we try very hard to be, work with our owners when they want to do major renovations. We get involved with that, and the town gets involved, you need a building permit. How is Eastman gonna, if we say, yes, we want to do this, but make very specific, you can only do it this way, you can only do it that way, is our current management structure in a way that we can, do that and, get the building inspector out when it's done, and then manage it moving forward if we're gonna have multiple families living in specific units. We've now changed that building into now the owner has changed the whole paradigm of what that structure is. So we're gonna if we do this, we're gonna have a bigger variety of homes. And is Eastman comfortable managing that reality?
Eastman or me? Yeah. As part of, after the last council meeting, maybe it was the one before that, there was a group that was formed of council members and board members to look at ADUs, just to help educate and populate the survey. And one of the things that we did as part of that work was I reached out to the other large communities in posted a notice on the listserv that we use, the other large-scale managers, and asked, how are you guys managing EDUs? What's happening in the community? And there was one response from a manager in California, where the California law does not allow the distinction that we have here in New Hampshire. And so they do exactly what you described. They can, and they do, perform the functions that the ECC does. So if you're gonna have an EDU, this is what it's gonna look like. This is how it's gonna appear on your property. So we can get very specific in terms of how the building is gonna look, and we can manage that. That's part of what we do anyway, right? It's part of what the ECC does. They've been very busy the last few years, post-COVID, managing kind of the buildings that have happened within the community. And so I would expect that we would follow the same process. If the community decides, hey, ADUs are what we want, but we want to make them fit within the Eastman aesthetic and make sure that it doesn't impact the existing neighborhoods, or especially in condo areas, how they can, how we can incorporate that. I'm confident that we can make that happen. Yeah.
Okay,
Anybody, any new questions?
okay, Bill?
Hang on one second.
So, a couple of things. One, I was asked to make a clarification. The question of effect and population and whatnot. Remember, so you can allow ADUs, or you can allow ADUs and allow them to be rented. So the questions of population shifts and more people and whatnot only happens if you allow the ADUs to be rented. If you, but I gotta tell you, you get this pressure, So, and the other point I wanna make is, right now it costs somewhere between $165,000 and $215,000 to build an ADU. That's the state average in New Hampshire. So somebody spends $165,000, they're gonna want a return on that investment. So it creates a pressure, but it only happens if you allow them to be rented. So, if they're not rented, I guess they just sit there, but.
I think you all answered very well on regarding ADUs. I don't think we're gonna see them too far in our future, that's for sure. But what was brought up, I think that would be of interest to more people to really get into, is the fact of having caregivers. Right now, that's not permitted.
Actually, that's not necessarily true.
What has to happen to allow that? Because we're all that age.
Okay, if you were listening to Steve, he said that an ADU requires an ability to separate the ADU from the dwelling unit. If you have a caregiver who's living in your lower level, and there's no separating door between them, nobody's gonna say boo.
I don't think that's what he fully said. What I couldn't have heard you.
Did I misunderstand you, Steve?
Was that if there's any sort of renting, money going back and forth, that becomes the problem.
Same money.
Well, but
Caregiver.
under the situation that was discussed earlier, was that the caregiver might pay a small amount of rent, and you would then offset it with what you would get or Medicare would pay. So that's what I'm asking about.
The financial arrangements associated with what the stipend you pay somebody is and what any housing allocation might be is something that I don't want to know about.
The answer is it can be done, and it's simple. It's one-page document. State law says you can sign this caregiver agreement, okay? And we had proposed allowing Eastman residents to sign caregiver agreements and just notify the ECA quarterly that this agreement is in force, and then whatever you do under that agreement is fine.
So it doesn't matter about rent or not rent.
I disagree with Paul, it does matter, okay, if you're collecting rent from someone. But his solution is basically change the DCR.
Well,
I'm Sue Johnson. I didn't know Bill was gonna ask that question. But I wanted to follow up on what the Terry said about financial viability of being able to stay in your home. And I know people that have moved out of Eastman because they could no longer afford it, and they had a person renting a room in their unit. Now, I believe the DCR says no more than 4 unrelated people can occupy a unit. I believe that's in the bylaws somewhere. So if you've got 2 people in a unit, you're not violating that. And say one person in the couple dies, why can't you bring another person in to add their income to allow you to stay there by paying you rent? And how could that be arranged?
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like Bill and Sue are working on something.
I think I'm in trouble.
Someone have a room for Bill? Yeah. The bottom line is that you can't occupy and rent. That's it. You know, if you have some arrangement where, as Susan said, I don't want to know about what you're kind of doing in terms of how you make your mortgage or your assessment. But if you're actively renting your property and living there, that's not allowed.
Well, you can't have a roommate.
You can have
So you can't have a roommate sharing expenses?
depends on what you mean by expense.
No, I want an answer. I mean, I really would like, I can't.
Yeah, the answer is no. That's in our, those are our,
Sorry.
your covenants.
Yeah, okay. I just think that it'd be nice if that could be changed.
Yeah.
I'm one person in a 3-level, okay, I'm not using the amenities of a family of 5, so why can't I have a roommate? I would like that changed. That's my decision.
Okay.
I'll be quick. Rent, a renter, please define what renter is. Does a renter imply the paying of money? Is that what differentiates a renter from someone, say, living like a caregiver?
Legally, a renter is a person who pays money or other consideration for the right to occupy property.
Okay, thank you. And so that means in the case of, say, a caregiver, and I can't imagine a caregiver actually paying the rent. Usually the money is going to go the other direction for a caregiver. So a caregiver would be allowed. There's a caregiver can live in a home right now, right? They're not a renter. If they're not paying the money, they're not a renter.
Okay, folks, we have time for one more question and then we're done.
I just, thank you, I just wanted to make a clarification, because somebody noted about what was in the last resident survey or owner survey. And it was interesting because in the pre-COVID, we had 40% full-time residents and 60% part-time residents. And post-COVID, when we did the most recent survey, that number flipped. That is different than saying, where is your residence? Because in a lot of places, we know a lot of people who are here for 6 months plus 1 day and live somewhere else for 6 months minus a day. And would you call them part-time or would you call them full-time? So when we think about, do you live in the house while somebody is renting there? Do they have to live in the house? Do they have to be a resident? What does that mean?
Right.
All right, so I hope we can all join in thanking our panel. Anyway, I really appreciate the fact that so many of them were willing to give so much of their time tonight, and since I sent them homework in advance too, they had to spend a lot of time before they came here. And the other people I'd like to thank is you. Thanks very much for coming, thanks very much for caring enough to spend time on your evening when you could have been doing something else, probably funner than this. But anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you.